Good morning. Thank you once again for coming to my YouTube channel to follow this series focused on my recent life history here in the state of Massachusetts. This is episode 47 of my YouTube channel, which I launched earlier this year in June of 2020. In this episode, episode 47, I am continuing to share the experience of my life in these last 18 months or so. In the most recent episode, episode 46, I discussed some of my recent history prior to moving to the state of Massachusetts, as well as my decision to work for a company called Vinfen here in the state of Massachusetts. In that episode, I briefly described the work of Vinfen Corporation, and I began to describe the role that I held in 2019 as a residential counselor working at a group home located on Cape Cod here in the state of Massachusetts. In this episode, I'm going to speak at greater length about the reasonable accommodation process, and I am going to disclose more about my own personal history as well as the history of my time working for Vinfen. Once again, I'm going to do my best to keep this episode to 30 minutes and continue to record future episodes in increments of 30 minutes of time. So, I left off talking about my work for Vinfen Corporation. Before I go into that work history once more, I'm going to speak a little bit about the experience of being a man with a disability. So in the year 2013, 7 years ago, I was diagnosed as having post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time that I was diagnosed, I was very shocked by the diagnosis because prior to that time, in my earlier life history, both as an adult as well as a minor, I had received treatment for the issues that led me to feel traumatized. I will go into greater detail about the treatment history in a subsequent episode. Right now, I simply want to just describe the fact that I was a person who had a history of a disability when I moved to the state of Washington, to the state of Massachusetts in 2019. So, when people have a disability, we are fortunate in this country to have some policies and accommodations in place to enable those of us who have a history of disability to nonetheless participate in society, to participate in the workplace, to enjoy personal lives of some measure of satisfaction, and to enjoy some of the very same opportunities that people who do not have a disability customarily enjoy. It's important to understand, as you listen to me in these videos, that I did not have an accurate understanding of my health and of what had undermined my health until very much later in life than would be ideal. For some children, they are fortunate to find proper treatment for their health concerns when they are still minors because they have access to resources that enable them to get really good care. And obviously, access to good care is a function of the quality of the parents that they have, their socioeconomic status, their parents' spiritual and psychological values, and many other factors. So basically, there are many factors that come into play that ultimately can impact the evolution of a childhood and how a person does as an adult. I personally did not receive effective care for my health concerns until I was in my 30s and 40s. And due to that fact, I made decisions as a younger man that I might not have made had I had an accurate understanding of my health at a younger age. And I will go into more detail about the ramifications of that in future episodes as well. So, those of us who have disabilities, we are given opportunities to overcome these disabilities through certain policies in place at local, state, and federal levels of government. I'm going to now read to you directly from the content available on the Department of Labor website. This is specifically listed on the Office of Disability Employment Policy page, and you will find the link to this page in the information box for this video. Under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way things are usually done during the hiring process. These modifications enable an individual with a disability to have an equal opportunity not only to get a job, but successfully perform their job tasks to the same extent as people without disabilities. The ADA, also known as the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires reasonable accommodations as they relate to three aspects of employment. 1. Ensuring equal opportunity in the application process. 2. Enabling a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of a job. And 3. Making it possible for an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. Accommodations are sometimes referred to as, quote, productivity enhancers. Reasonable accommodations should not be viewed as special treatment, and they often benefit all employees. For example, facility enhancements such as ramps, accessible restrooms, and ergonomic workstations benefit more than just employees with disabilities. Examples of reasonable accommodations include making existing facilities accessible, job restructuring, part-time or modified work schedules, acquiring or modifying equipment, changing tests, training materials or policies, and providing qualified readers or interpreters. Here are some examples. Many job accommodations cost very little and often involve minor changes to a work environment, schedule, or work-related technologies. Some changes include physical changes, such as installing a ramp or modifying a restroom, or modifying the layout of a workspace. Reasonable accommodations can also take the form of accessible and assistive technologies, such as ensuring computer software is accessible, providing screen reader software, using video phones to facilitate communications with colleagues who are deaf. Reasonable accommodations can also be comprised of accessible communications, such as providing sign language interpreters or closed captioning at meetings and events, making materials available in braille or large print. Reasonable accommodations can also consist of policy enhancements, such as modifying a policy to allow a service animal in a business setting, adjusting work schedules so employees with chronic medical conditions can go to medical appointments and complete their work at alternate times or locations. So these are but some examples of reasonable accommodations that can be requested and provided in the workplace. And as I said, the content that I have just read word for word is available on the Department of Labor website under the Office of Disability Employment Policy, and that link is provided in the information box for this video. So, reasonable accommodations are essentially a way that Americans with disabilities can find greater access and inclusion in the workplace here in the United States of America. In a separate episode, I am also going to go into greater detail regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is a 30-year-old piece of legislation that was a seminal piece of legislation for people in the disabled community. So, now, getting back to my work history with Vinfen. As I noted in the last episode, I began working for the company in the year 2019. After some concerns regarding my ability to conduct my tasks in an appropriate and timely way, I decided to request a reasonable accommodation of my employer. And I'm now going to describe in greater detail what ultimately happened using a document that I have created in the not too distant past that I used to provide material when I was when I had information requested of me from the Massachusetts Department of Unemployment Assistance. So in May 2019, I began the process of exploring the possibility of requesting a reasonable accommodation of my employer. I made this request due to my concerns regarding the potential impact to my fibromyalgia by working in the role that I had. On Monday, May 27th, I worked the Memorial Day holiday at the group home where I was assigned. And the reason that I'm going to give particular details about my work history is to provide substantiation so that my integrity and character cannot be credibly defamed by Vinfen or any third party that might seek to cause me further harm by my decision to disclose what is being shared in these videos. During the time that I worked for Vinfen, I worked all of the major holidays within the window of time that I worked for the company. I worked Memorial Day and I worked the 4th of July. I worked holidays because I wanted to demonstrate that I was a person who was reliable and who had a work ethic. And I worked the holidays just because I was expected to do so. But I made the sacrifice of not working on holidays when I could have been out doing something fun or making friends. Instead, I worked these holidays for this company because I was intent on developing a good work history and relationship with the company. On Tuesday, May 28th, my insurance provider, Cigna, mailed the Americans with Disabilities Act paperwork necessary for me to complete as part of my request for a reasonable accommodation. The form that I received requested that it be returned within 15 calendar days, which was thus June 12, 2019. On Thursday, June 13th, one day after that 15-day window of time, I requested an extension for completion of the paperwork. The new due date that was given for me was Monday, June 24th. The reason I requested the extension was that my regular healthcare provider was not available until June 19th to complete the forms. I therefore needed more time to complete them. On Friday, June 21st, I submitted my ADA paperwork, and on the same day, Cigna submitted that paperwork directly to the Human Resources Office for Vinfen. Now, it's important to note that in late June of 2019, shortly before my request for reasonable accommodation was denied, I learned of some very concerning news in my personal life. Specifically, I learned that my father had been hospitalized for many months in the state of Texas where I grew up. When I learned of this news, I was understandably saddened and concerned. And though my father and I are essentially estranged in the present day, I nonetheless still do care about what happens to him, and thus I was upset to learn that he had been hospitalized for many months and that he had not told me about this. I share this to provide greater context so that you, my viewers, will understand the depth of the stress that I was feeling at the time. I was also in the process of moving to another place to live on Cape Cod in late June, and so a number of issues all came to bear at the same time. I was continuing to work not just my job with Vinfen, but a second job. I was moving, and I had learned that my father had been hospitalized for many months. On Tuesday, July 2nd, which was a day that I was actually actively moving to my new residence, I took a single personal day of leave for the purpose of making time to move. This was the first day of leave that I used. I had received 24 hours of paid leave to use as of July 1st, 2019. On that day, I received a phone call indicating that my reasonable accommodation request was not going to be granted. And on that day, I did not appreciate the fact that I was being contacted while I was in the process of moving, which I was doing using a personal day off. I would have appreciated it if they had actually shared that information with me on my next work day, which was the following day of July 3rd. On that day, so in early July, I worked the 4th of July as well. There was minimal coverage that day provided at the group home that I worked at. On Sunday, July 7th, I dropped by my work site just to check to ensure that there was sufficient coverage and that there wasn't any need of me. I was off that day, but I dropped by just to double check that there wasn't any need of help from my coworkers. And I dropped by also because I was trying again to demonstrate my commitment to my job and to supporting my coworkers. On Monday, July 8th, I provided coverage to another group home on Cape Cod after being asked to do so. It is important to note that I was not customarily scheduled to work on Mondays. On Tuesday, July 9th, I accidentally misplaced my car keys while on a shift at the house that I customarily worked at. This caused me to be not able to make my appointment I had scheduled with one of my healthcare providers. And because I missed that appointment, I subsequently was not able to speak with my healthcare provider directly regarding the paperwork that I had submitted. Now, the reason I share this is because the paperwork I submitted in requesting my reasonable accommodation was not correctly filled out by my healthcare provider. My healthcare provider disclosed an incorrect, she disclosed the wrong information. I had requested the reasonable accommodation by virtue of my history of having fibromyalgia. But what my healthcare provider noted instead was my history of having post-traumatic stress disorder. So, essentially, my healthcare provider made a major mistake that, in some sense, influenced potentially the outcome for my request for a reasonable accommodation. And what I find concerning about this is that, in my opinion, if a person has two health conditions, fibromyalgia and post-traumatic stress disorder, which would an employer find to be a more concerning health condition to learn about? In my opinion, it would be post-traumatic stress disorder. Why? Because post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that can develop in response to any number of very, very horrific, traumatizing experiences. People who develop post-traumatic stress disorder can be, and often are, people who have been abducted, people who have had their life threatened, people who have been robbed at gunpoint, people who have lived through a natural disaster, people who have witnessed their friends or family be assaulted or murdered. There are many things that can cause a person to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And because so many of them are so horrific, in my opinion, it would seem that if an employer learned that their employee had a history of post-traumatic stress disorder, that they might take pause and decide that maybe, just maybe, it would be wise to actually have a thorough conversation with that person about their need for reasonable accommodation on the basis of having learned that this person has post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD in their medical history. On the other hand, fibromyalgia, while a very serious condition that can be debilitating for those who have it, isn't necessarily as likely to be attributable to a horrific incident as horrible as the many things that can cause someone to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, according to the reading that I've done, fibromyalgia can develop in response to a number of things, some of which can also cause someone to develop PTSD. However, fibromyalgia, from what I understand, can also develop due to other incidents, such as surgeries that go wrong. Fibromyalgia can develop, from what I understand, due to an injury like a car accident, like what might happen in a car accident. Now, are such incidents like car accidents also things that can cause PTSD to develop? Yes. But from what I understand, which I believe is based on fairly thorough reading, it seems to me that someone who has PTSD would probably be taken more seriously when they request a reasonable accommodation than people who have a history of fibromyalgia. There are still people in the medical community to this day who question the validity of fibromyalgia as a meaningful diagnosis, as something that is real. I personally think it's real, partly because I live with it, and it's very real to me. But from what I understand, PTSD is given more credibility as a real, genuine health disorder as compared to fibromyalgia. So, in making the mistake that she did, my healthcare provider, in my opinion, made it more likely, theoretically, that my employer would have taken pause and thought, oh, this man has a history of post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe we should take his request seriously, and maybe, just maybe, we should have a thorough conversation with him. But that is not what happened. At no time during the time that Vinfen was reviewing my paperwork, requesting a reasonable accommodation, did I actually receive the type of interaction that I believe, according to the law, is required. If you look at reasonable accommodation policy, if you look at the language that is used, one of the key words that is used is the word interactive. When a person is requesting a reasonable accommodation of their employer, they are ideally going to have an interactive process with that employer. And in my experience, my process of requesting the reasonable accommodation that I requested was not sufficiently interactive. At no point in that process did my employer, did any representative of the company in HR or outside of HR, at no point did I have a substantive conversation with a person in authority who would have an influence in the outcome of that request. And by substantive, I mean a conversation of substantial length, something more than a 2-minute phone call, something in which I can elaborate upon my concerns and my health condition in a way that the employer can make an informed decision about my needs so that I can continue to work in my role. At no point in the process did my employer, Vinfen Corporation, engage in a substantial phone call, engage in a substantial dialogue via email, or engage in a substantial conversation in person to ensure that a thorough assessment of my request was made and thereby a well-determined decision could be made. And so my request was denied, and my request, in my considered opinion, was not substantially interactive. And therefore, I believe that Vinfen violated maybe not the letter of the law, but certainly the spirit of the law that exists within the framework established by the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in the year 1990, some 30 years ago. And the fact that Vinfen Corporation is a company that is involved in providing mental health services to residents of the state of Massachusetts is, I believe, confounding, amazing, and outrageous. This is what this company is in the business of doing. This is not a company that manages financial resources for people for their retirements. This is not a company that works in any number of other industries. They don't create machinery for construction workers. They don't do things in pharmaceuticals. They don't create new medicines. They don't work like police officers and first responders do to immediately respond to crises involving injury, attempted murder, crimes in the community. They don't do these things. What Vinfen does is provide services to people focused on mental health and wellness. This is their focus. This is their mission. This is what they do when you read from their website. And despite the fact that this is what they are on a mission to do, this is how I experienced them as an employee. I had my request for a reasonable accommodation denied, and in my considered opinion, they did not take the time and the energy to seriously review and assess my request. And on that basis, among other concerns, I subsequently decided to hire a lawyer and make a filing against Vinfen Corporation with the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. That filing was made in late 2019, and very recently I learned that my filing with MCAD, the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, I learned that it was dismissed for lack of probable cause. Do I believe that because MCAD decided against me that there was no improper conduct? Absolutely not. And I have only begun to share the full extent of what happened to me during my time as an employee of Vinfen that I believe in retrospect was outrageous, irresponsible, and genuinely cruel. Genuinely cruel. I have experienced a lot of cruelty in my life. I experienced it when I was a kid, when I had two older stepsisters who abused me physically and verbally, when I was a little boy. I experienced cruel indifference when my father was nearly murdered and the justice system failed him due to corruption. I experienced the failure of law enforcement, failing to do their jobs properly. There is much about this which I experienced 38 years ago that I will never have the full information that I would like to have about it. And I've been expected to live with that. And that in itself is a horror. And so people that go through horrific things like having their loved ones disappear and they never hear from them again, that is horrifying. Watching people die in the streets, homeless and alone, without family to help them, that is horrifying. Watching people in our government fail to care about their constituents dying of preventable health care, preventable health conditions, that is horrifying. And living through what we're living through now, a global public health emergency in which over 265,000 Americans have died of a contagious viral condition. That is horrifying. And it's horrifying that people like me who approach companies in good faith to secure a job and work in support of a lofty mission, such as providing mental health care, resources, and support to those who need it here in the state of Massachusetts. It is appalling and horrifying that companies in the business of doing that can be so flippant and disrespectful of the people they employ. That is horrifying and, in my opinion, cruel. I mentioned a few minutes ago that there's more to the story of what happened, and there is. In the next episode, I am going to go into greater detail about what happened after my reasonable accommodation request was denied by Vinfen Corporation. It is a very sad and lengthy story that was potentially preventable if I had had more help, more skilled help, and if I had more compassionate, good people in my life at the time. But I was vulnerable. I was vulnerable because I have a history of a disability. I was vulnerable because I had moved to the state of Massachusetts and I did not have a large support system yet. I was vulnerable for a number of reasons. And despite being that vulnerable, I still cared. Despite being that vulnerable, I still participated in the world. Despite being that vulnerable, I applied to work in a job in the healthcare industry and dared to care. Despite all of those things, I dared to care, I showed up, I participated in the world, and I was treated in a way that I firmly believe was incredibly inappropriate, unkind, and yes, genuinely cruel. There's much more to the story. It will be coming in the next episode. Thank you for watching this episode. I am an advocate for people with disabilities. I advocate for myself, and I believe in advocating for others despite everything I've gone through. I welcome you to follow along, not just in this series of videos, but follow along on my YouTube channel. Thank you for watching, and I welcome you to watch future episodes as time permits. Have a great day.